Hello, my name is Makoto Iwahashi from labor NGO based in Tokyo, Japan called Posse. Today, I'd like to talk about the state of Karoshi in Japan and the role of labor NGOs like us in terms of how in the fight against reducing Karoshi and overwork from Japan. Um, Today, I would like to use the PowerPoint slide to explain the situation in Japan regarding Karoshi. And the outline of today's presentation will be first, I'd like to briefly introduce what Posse does, and second, I'm going to show the state of Karoshi and overwork in Japan, and what difficulties the victims' families face in order to just receive compensation, and lastly, the role of NGOs and labor unions in this situation. About Posse, we are a not-for-profit organization established in 2006. It is a group of college students and young workers advocating for workers' rights. And the main work of ours is that we have a worker hotline, which provides free legal consultation to workers. It receives around 3,000 calls and emails in 1 year from workers all over Japan, um, complaining and who are concerned about overworking, including karoshi, and unpaid wages, workplace injuries, and other kinds of various harassments, including sexual harassment, among many issues. Last year, we established an English hotline to offer free legal advice to English-speaking workers in Japan, and also we have a hotline in Chinese as well, in order to help migrant workers, which where the Japan is increasingly accepting. We are also a founding member of Karoshi Watch in East Asia, which has a website there and has various reports from Japan and South Korea and Taiwan NGOs discussing karoshi and overwork issues in those three countries. When I say karoshi and karojisatsu, it became a major social issue in Japan in the 90s, and it is now adopted internationally. So the words karoshi and karojisatsu, which karoshi literally means that death from overwork in Japanese. Karojisatsu literally means that suicide death from overwork. And since it is adopted internationally, we can use these terms to describe exactly what is happening. Karoshi, in a narrow sense, indicates a death caused by brain or heart disease. In a broader meaning, it includes both karoshi in a narrow sense and karojisatsu. So when I say karoshi, it could mean I'm indicating a death caused by a brain or heart disease, or it could mean I'm including both karoshi and karojisatsu. This graph compares the percentage of workers working over 49 hours per week in 2019. And you can see that Japan, especially men, 26.3% of men are working around 10 hours of overtime per week. And it is, second most to South Korea when you look at the graph comparing six developed countries. In Japan, there are many karoshi cases, and there are karoshi cases in major internationally known companies like Toyota and Dentsu and many other companies in Japan. But we know that there were Karoshi in those companies because they are in the news. To be exact, to be officially recognized as Karoshi, the victim's family must submit an application to the Labor Standards Office or the government demanding compensation through the workplace injury compensation insurance program. So if there is no application submitted, then the government cannot officially recognize the death as work-related. And after that application is submitted, the government conducts an investigation to determine whether the death or the disease the victim might not have passed away was work-related or not, just like any other workplace injuries. Death recognized by the government as work-related are considered karoshi. So, and they are compensated. And this graph shows workplace injury compensation application cases regarding brain and heart disease and mental illness. You can see that the number of application cases for brain or heart diseases are basically staying the same. It was 931 in 2007 and 936 in 2019. But if you look at mental illness cases, it was 952 in 2007, and now it is more than 200 or 2,000, excuse me. So you can see that mental illness is a major issue in Japan. So the last graph was about we looked at application cases, but this graph looks at the actual compensated cases or the cases that the government has decided as work-related. And you can see that in 2019, 216 cases of brain or heart disease cases were recognized by the government as work-related. And among 216, 86 was death cases. And when we compare this graph to the last graph, in the last graph, there were 936 brain and or heart disease cases, application cases, and the actual compensated cases are 216. So just because you submitted application doesn't mean that you can receive compensation, and most do not receive compensation. And it is even more of a problem in mental illness cases where compensated cases only are 509 and 88 are death or suicide attempt cases among 2,060 cases. So about only a quarter of the application cases are actually receive compensation, and this blue line indicates suicide cases, and where the police, which has to conduct an investigation on each suicide case on what the reasoning was behind each suicide case, And they determined that work was one of the reasons for the person committing suicide. And in 2019, it was 1,949. So there are at least about 2,000 people committing suicide every year, and the police found out that those cases were work related, but among those 2,000 cases, only 88 or a bit below 100 are compensated every year. So there is a huge undercount in this stats, and one of the reasons is that there is this standards called Karoshi threshold, which indicates that it is the government standards to determine whether the death is work related or not. And in the case of brain and or heart disease, it is 100 hours of overtime over 1 month period, or an average of 80 hours of overtime over 2 to 6 month period. So you have to be doing more than 80 hours of overtime, or in most cases, your application is going to be denied. In a case of mental illness, you have to be working more than 160 hours of overtime over 30 days before experiencing illness, or you have to average 100 hours of overtime over a 3 month period. So it so this standards is set pretty high that in a case of mental illness, you have to be basically working 16 hours every day to even qualify to receive compensation. Of course, the government also investigates other factors like harassment, sexual harassment, bullying, and all those work-related issues. But working hours is the main factor in determining whether the death was work-related or not. And the difficulty that every victim's family face is that when applying for compensation, they're the ones who must provide evidence that the victim was overworking. And many companies do not keep track of accurate working hours data. And it is not even mandated by law for companies to keep track of accurate working hours data. So what is happening is that basically it creates an incentive for companies not to keep track of accurate data. And even if there were accurately kept timesheets, companies regularly refuse to disclose them to the victims' families because they are afraid that they could be held accountable for the death if it was proven to be work related. And it is very difficult for the victim's family to prove that because they're not the ones who are working, and they don't know how long the victim was working. And the victim's family who cannot prove overtime behind the death, it is difficult for them to be compensated. It becomes especially difficult in cases involving harassment and bullying. It is difficult for the victim's family to prove that there was some kind of harassment when they're not there. And most of the times, employees who were working with the victim are told by the employer that not to speak about the incident. So most of the times, it's really difficult for the victim's family to collect any kind of information. And even if they were able to do it, um, the victim's family, even if they thought that the death was work related, unless the family submits an application for workplace injury compensation, so it's not going to be counted as karoshi. And most families do think at the time of death that it is work related, but many do not know that they are eligible to apply for or how to apply for workplace injury compensation. And the company usually discourages the victim's family to apply for compensation by claiming that it was the victim's fault. We've seen companies claim that he was eating unhealthy, so he got a heart attack, or he had a heart attack because he was playing video games, which deprived him of enough quality sleep. So companies, tell these things to um, the victims' families, um, and the sole purpose is to make them not apply, so that the company does not be held accountable. So what we have to do, what labor unions and labor NGOs have to do, is that we have to help these victims um, gain compensation. Karoshi is, essentially legal in Japan. It is not a punishable crime, um, and nobody's gonna be arrested. Nobody had ever been arrested for the company basically, killing someone um, through overwork. And there was not an overtime cap until 2019. So it was possible for employers to make employees work uh, 24 hours, 365 days a week, or not a week, but a year. And even now, even after the cap is set, it is set at 100 hours of overtime per month, which is right at the Karoshi threshold. So the government is basically saying that you can make someone work until um, he or she, there is a chance that he or she loses his or her life. So this is what it is. So as labor NGOs helping and combating the culture of long working hours, we have to help the victim's family apply for workplace injury compensation by encouraging them to apply and gathering necessary evidence to prove that there was overwork and that they should be eligible to receive compensation. Also, we have to hold the company accountable and make them provide compensation for the victim's family, because the compensation that you receive from through workplace injury compensation scheme is just a part of um, what they should be eligible to receive. And to most victims, it is extremely difficult for them to stand up just by themselves against these major companies. So unless NGOs assist them to stand up with them, Karoshi is going to be invisible. And what we are seeing right now is just the tip of the iceberg, and it's going to remain the tip of the iceberg. Thank you for listening, and this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.